You want to jump in on this thing?
Sure, let's jump in. Our first question this week is from Cassandra, and Cassandra wrote a very, very lengthy question. And I'm
Great
just going to
detail,
read
but it's
really
pretty
wonderful
long.
detail, but
Yeah.
I'm just going to read some sections of it. But the main gist of her question is, how do you recommend tackling post-workout nutrition for endurance and high-intensity sports while on keto? So let's see here. Okay, so she says, I think I'm generally fat adapted, but I panic after 8 or 9 miles sometimes because the old advice of carb loading always creeps back in. And I will suck down a terrible gel or Gatorade because I've made the mistake of running these distances underfueled before, and it was a painful, painful lesson. I've heeded your electrolyte advice, and I constantly track my sodium, magnesium, and potassium levels and take the recommended supplements almost every day, normally on days with a taxing WOD or a workout lasting more than 90 minutes. So what can I eat or drink to keep on the keto train that will help me recover and keep me going on some of these endurance events? Nut butters, whey protein, and water. I want to be armed when I take on Vegas this year and not completely derail my eating habits, and I'd like to start experimenting with these foods now while I still have time to adjust. Sorry for writing the novel. So just to fill in some of the details, she has done several half marathons and a marathon, and she's wanting to do another full marathon later this year, the Rock and Roll in Las Vegas.
And lots of great details. So if you guys check out the show
We'll post
notes,
the
you
full
can
question,
kind of dig into that stuff. So one thing up front, I'm definitely not an endurance coach. Like, we've dabbled in that area when we ran the gym. It wasn't really my area of interest nor expertise. So I'm going to give some general guidelines, but I'm not an endurance coach. That said, one thing that I would recommend is following all the work from Zach Bitter. He has set multiple, I think, national and world champion distances, 100-mile races,
Wow.
largely keto fueled, keto carnivore fueled. He drops in some carbs though, and he has kind of a strategy around what he does with that. Part of what she related is she feels soreness and difficulty recovering after her hard sessions, in particular when she's using carbs, interestingly. And this is one of the interesting things that folks that are in that keto carnivore space seem to report. They just seem to bounce back from workouts better. Like, they don't seem to get the delayed onset muscle soreness and all that stuff. And it's kind of funny, before we were recording this, I was kind of noodling in the shower about how low carb in the context of a higher protein, like ketogene style ketogenic diet or carnivore diet, or even some of the old, original Lauren Cordain protein recommendations, even though it's low carb technically because you're not eating carbohydrate as part of the diet, it's not necessarily low glycogen. The keto scene has gotten all freaked out about gluconeogenesis and being kicked out of ketosis, but this is all still like super context driven stuff. For an individual that needs really legit levels of ketones for, say, like neurological condition or for cancer co-treatment or something like that, then there's a compelling reason to kind of limit protein. But what's interesting is that, and again, I'm going to bounce around, like there's a zillion things I'm thinking about, but Charles Poliquin recommended for people who were not particularly carb sensitive but doing high intensity training a pretty high protein, low carb diet, and then supplemental glutamine post workout, because the glutamine was kind of a slow release way of topping off glycogen levels both in the liver and the muscles, but that didn't have some of the other side effects potentially of carbs. And I know people are going to freak out. It's like, oh, carbs aren't the devil. Yeah, they're not, except when they are. And like, for some people like me who still have some sort of GI problems or what have you, type 1 diabetics, or people that are just tinkering with this stuff, like, there are other ways of getting reasonably good glycogen repletion while also still staying in more of that kind of fat adapted world. So one thing about this, and we have to break this stuff into, kind of training nutrition, event nutrition, post-recovery nutrition. And so during the event, this is definitely where she made the point that she needs to experiment with this stuff and see what's working. And again, I would kind of punt to what Zach Bitter does as just kind of a beginning baseline. I think that in general, if he's doing something that's more in that 100-mile pace, he stays pretty much fat and protein. Because he's going to be going at such a gentle pace comparatively, because he's going to run for basically like 2 days straight. And so he's just not going to get glycolytic. So in that context, then there doesn't necessarily need to be additional carbs or not much additional carbs, to the degree that there might be a lot of elevation change or something like that, and therefore going anaerobic, getting some glycolysis going on. Then we might drop in some type of carb. And again, you just have to play around with that stuff to see what sits well, with gastric emptying and all that type of stuff. I feel like I'm just kind of bouncing around here, but it's interesting. So she also mentions that, that in the past, she was kind of worried at some point. And this is where I think doing some training runs that are on the longer side, and to establish, like, how do you do, so she said that she panics after 8 or 9 miles sometimes. So there should probably be some like 12 or 15 mile runs consistently within the training block where you pressure test this. Like, how do you feel at mile 10 through 15 with a particular type of training without necessarily doing a go or something like that. And even that said, there are a lot of people in the low carb space that over the course of a day of activity like this, they may consume 200 or 300 grams of carbs on that day, which is still quite a bit less than what most other people are doing. But this is where there's just a massive amount of individual variation. And again, I'm just not the most knowledgeable person on that side of things. But so the takeaways, we don't necessarily need to just cater towards ketosis. Don't think about it being ketosis. Think about it being performance fueling. It may be on the lower carb side. It may be on the higher carb side. Even if it's on the lower carb side, if our protein intake is higher, it doesn't necessarily mean low glycogen for the body. And so that can have all kinds of ramifications for recovery and nutrient intake. So
she definitely needs to make sure she's not skimping on the protein.
Absolutely, yeah. The one caveat with that, and this is where it gets really detailed, in event training, you may be, particularly if water's maybe a little bit limited or what have you, higher protein intake requires more water to deal with the ammonia load that's coming out of that. But you don't necessarily want to go super low protein, because you will burn through all your branched chain amino acids and then tryptophan levels raise. The person will be running along and they get sleepy and they'll literally like fall asleep. And it happens a lot on a bicycle mid-run, or at a minimum you lose some of that kind of motivation because you're getting sleepy. So this is some of the stuff, again, that folks just have to play with, like what protein level keeps you mentally alert because you have enough branched chain amino acids in the mix. Some people use some branched chain amino acids as part of their, training mix and stuff like that. But this is, again, where it's just super outside my wheelhouse. But those are some kind of big, broad brush strokes that to consider when you're doing this stuff. Yeah.